There is a river. It moves slowly, as rivers in old places tend to do, carrying with it the soft brown weight of soil from hills far upstream, hills that have been standing since long before any human eye looked out across them and thought of home. The river is called the Tiber. It has always been called the Tiber, or something very close to that name, a word worn smooth by centuries of mouths repeating it the way water wears stone, gradually, without effort, without any particular intention. The Tiber moves through the middle of a landscape that is gentle in its way, not dramatic, not harsh, but quietly beautiful in the manner of things that have simply always been there. Low hills rise along its banks, grassland spread between them. In the morning, mist comes off the water and drifts upward through stands of oak and elm, catching the earliest light, turning it gold, then dissolving slowly as the sun climbs. This is where Rome will be. But for a very long time there is no Rome. There is only the land and the light, and the river moving softly through it all. The hills that will one day bear the name of Rome are 7 in number, though that count depends somewhat on who is counting and in what age they are doing their counting. They rise from the plain beside the Tiber in a loose cluster, none of them very tall, none of them dramatic or sheer. They are the kind of hills that invite rest rather than effort, rounded at their tops, covered in long grass and scrubby trees, catching the afternoon sun on their western faces, and cooling slowly in the evenings when the air comes down from the higher country to the east. The Palatine is perhaps the most central of them, sitting close enough to the river to hear it but high enough above the marshy lowlands to stay dry. The Capitoline is smaller and steeper, looking out over the bend of the Tiber. The Aventine, the Caelian, the Esquiline, the Viminal, the Quirinal, each has its own character, its own subtle shape, its own way of catching the morning shadow or holding the warmth of an afternoon in summer. Between the hills there are valleys, and in the valleys there are sometimes small streams, and along the streams there is soft ground, dark soil that holds moisture through the dry months, ground that is good for growing things. In the spring these valleys fill with the sound of water and the slow green rising of new vegetation. In the summer they are warm and still. In the autumn they smell of fallen leaves and damp earth. In the winter the mist comes back and the hills are quiet. For many thousands of years, this landscape knows nothing of cities or temples or roads. The land is inhabited, in the way that all habitable land eventually comes to be inhabited, by people moving through it, following the river, following the seasons, gathering what they need from what the land offers. These earliest people leave very little behind, a scatter of worked flint here, the trace of a fire there, the occasional carved piece of bone. They come and go with the rhythms of the seasons, light as leaves on water. Then gradually, something changes. It is not a dramatic change, not a single moment of decision or transformation. It is the kind of change that happens so slowly you could not watch it happening even if you tried. The kind of change that only becomes visible when you stand back and look across centuries the way you might look across a wide plain from a hilltop, seeing the broad shape of things rather than the particular details. Sometime in the centuries we now call the Bronze Age, people begin to stay. They begin to build things meant to last longer than a season. They keep animals in enclosures. They plant grain. They bury their dead in places they will return to, which means they are thinking about returning, which means they are beginning to think of themselves as belonging to a place. On the Palatine Hill, there are traces of these early settlements. Archaeologists in later centuries will find the post holes of small round huts, the kind of dwelling that is almost universal among settled people in their earliest phases, a circle of wooden posts sunk into the earth, filled in with wattle and daub, topped with a roof of thatch or reeds that sheds the rain and holds the warmth of a small fire. These huts are not impressive structures. They are humble, compact, close to the ground. Standing inside one, you would feel the warmth of the earth beneath you and smell the damp wood and hear, if you listened, the sound of the river below and the wind moving through the grass on the hilltop. There is something deeply restful about imagining these small dwellings, these earliest rooms, these quiet circles of shelter in which people laid down their tiredness at the end of a day and let themselves drift into sleep. The inhabitants of these early hilltop settlements are people we now group under the name Latins, though they would not have used that word themselves, or not yet, not in that way. They were one of several groups of peoples occupying different parts of the Italian peninsula in these early centuries, each speaking related but distinct versions of what we broadly call Italic languages, tongues that share deep roots, the way the rivers of a region share a common watershed, branching and rebranching, but drawing ultimately from the same source. To the north of the Latin villages were the Etruscans, a people of a somewhat different character, with their own writing system, their own religious practices, their own particular and distinctive art. To the south were Greek colonies along the coast, cities that had been founded by settlers from across the Aegean, bringing with them the olive and the vine and the alphabet and the gods of a warm sea far away. And there were other peoples too, the Sabines in the hills to the northeast, the Samnites further south, the Umbrians to the north and east, a complex patchwork of communities, each with its own territory, its own customs, its own particular way of understanding the world. Among these many peoples, the Latins of the Tiber Valley lived a life that was, in its broad outlines, agricultural and pastoral. They kept cattle and sheep on the hillsides. They grew emmer wheat in the valley bottoms. They made pottery by hand and fired it in simple kilns. They had gods of the field and the hearth, spirits of the threshold and the boundary stone, powers associated with the changing of the seasons and the bringing of rain. Their religious life was woven through the practical life of farming the way water is woven through soil, invisibly, essentially, reaching into everything. The god of the doorway was as real to them as the doorway itself. The spirit of the grain was as present in the field as the grain growing there. The location of the Latin settlement on and around the Palatine Hill was not an accident. The Tiber at that particular point in its course makes a wide, slow bend, and just below the hills a small island sits in the middle of the river, making it possible to wade or ford across in a way that is difficult at most other points. This ford, this crossing place, was of considerable practical importance in a landscape where rivers were significant obstacles. Anyone wishing to travel the length of Italy, following the western coast from north to south or returning north from the south, had to cross the Tiber, and the crossing at this point, below the Palatine and the Capitoline hills, was the easiest and most natural. The settlement here was not merely a settlement then, but a meeting place, a stopping point, a node in the slow traffic of people and animals and goods moving through the peninsula. Trade comes to crossing places. And where trade comes, communities grow and grow and grow. In the low ground between the hills, particularly in the broad valley between the Palatine and the Capitoline, there lay for a long time a marshy, frequently flooded area that was of limited use for habitation. The valley drained poorly. After heavy rain, the water stood for days. The grass here was coarse and damp. Later Romans would drain this valley and build upon it the Forum, the great civic heart of their city, and it is worth pausing to appreciate the quiet poetry of that transformation. A swamp becoming the center of the world, a place of standing water and croaking frogs becoming the place where the fate of empires was discussed under the open sky. But that transformation lies many centuries ahead. For now, the valley is simply wet ground, and the people on the hills look down at it as farmers look at difficult land, with a mixture of patience and calculation. The traditional date given for the founding of Rome is 753 BCE, a figure calculated in later centuries by Roman scholars attempting to count backward through their history to a single point of origin. The date is precise in the way that all mythological dates are precise, with a confident exactness that conceals the impossibility of the calculation. No city comes into being on a single day. No community springs fully formed from the ground. What we call the founding of Rome was in reality a long, slow process of consolidation, the gradual coming together of several separate hilltop communities into something that could, eventually, be called a single settlement, and then a town, and then, much later, a city. The Romans themselves told a story about this founding, of course, because all peoples tell stories about where they come from. The story they told was of a man named Romulus, the son of a god and a mortal woman, raised by a wolf in the wilderness, who came to the hills by the Tiber and with his brother Remus drew a line in the earth and declared that within that line a city would rise. The story is vivid and particular in the way of myths. It has a quarrel, a death, a boundary, a name. Romulus killed Remus for leaping over the newly drawn sacred boundary of the city, or so the story goes, and then built what he had promised. He became the first king. He named the city after himself, or perhaps after a word that already existed in that landscape, a word whose meaning has been debated ever since. Roma, a name that sounds like the Latin word for strength, or like the Etruscan word for river, or like neither of these, depending on which scholar you choose to read and in what century they were writing. What is certain is that the story of Romulus and Remus, however legendary in its details, carries within it a real memory of real conditions. The wolf that nursed the twins in the wilderness speaks to the dense, wild country that surrounded these early settlements, of forests full of wolves and boar and deer, country that was not yet cleared and cultivated, that pressed close against the edges of the inhabited hills. The founding act of drawing a boundary in the earth speaks to something genuinely ancient in Roman religious and legal thought, the sacred importance of the pomerium, the ritual boundary of the city, which was marked not merely as a legal concept, but as a sacred one, a line between the ordered world of the city and the wilder, less controllable world beyond. The killing of Remus for crossing that boundary speaks to how seriously the boundary was taken, how much weight was given to the difference between inside and outside, between the known and the unknown, between home and the vast, quiet, undifferentiated world beyond the edges of the familiar. There is another legend threaded through the Roman founding story, older even than Romulus, and that is the legend of Aeneas. Aeneas was a Trojan prince, a figure from the great body of Greek myth surrounding the fall of Troy, a city burned and destroyed in a war that Greeks and Romans alike placed far back in the mist of heroic time. In the Roman version of this story, Aeneas escaped the burning city carrying his aged father on his back and leading his small son by the hand, a figure of piety and endurance, a man who did what needed to be done without complaint and without turning back. He sailed westward across the Mediterranean, driven by the will of the gods and by the promise of a new home, arriving eventually on the shores of Italy. His descendants, through a long line of kings in the Latin city of Alba Longa, would include Romulus himself. The city of Rome, in this telling, was not merely a local development, not merely a village that grew, but the fulfillment of a divine plan that began at Troy and wound its slow way across the sea. The poet Virgil would tell this story in its fullest and most beautiful form, many centuries later, in the long poem called the Aeneid, writing in the age of Augustus when Rome had already become the center of a vast empire and needed a mythology worthy of its size. But the connection of Rome to Troy is older than Virgil, older than the empire, reaching back into the Republic and perhaps beyond. A way of making sense of Roman origins by connecting them to the oldest and most prestigious stories the Mediterranean world possessed. There is something quietly comforting in this idea, this notion that a city's story does not begin with itself, but with something earlier and elsewhere, that origins are always tangled with other origins, that the beginning of any one thing contains within it the endings of many others. The actual archaeological record of the Palatine and the surrounding hills in the period around 1000 to 700 BCE tells a quieter story than the myths, but in its quietness, it is no less interesting. The hilltop settlements that archaeologists have found are small and scattered in the earliest phases, perhaps a few dozen huts on the Palatine, similar clusters on the Quirinal and the Esquiline, each community separate, each with its own burial ground in the valley below. The dead were buried with their possessions, fibulae, the simple clasps used to fasten clothing, small pots of food and drink for the journey, occasional weapons or tools. The grave goods are modest, not rich, telling of a community that was comfortable but not wealthy, that had enough but not more than enough. Over time, the separate communities on the separate hills begin to share more. Burials that had been located in the valleys between the hills cease to be made there, a sign that the valleys are beginning to be used for other purposes, for gathering, for exchange, for the slow social activity of becoming neighbors rather than strangers. Pottery styles that had been distinct to each hilltop begin to blend and share characteristics, the way dialects blend at boundaries when communities talk to each other long enough. There is a gradual softening of the distinctions between communities, a slow movement towards something that could be called unity, though that word is perhaps too strong and too intentional for a process that was almost certainly happening without anyone quite noticing it was happening. This is how cities grow, most of the time, not through decisions but through drift, not through proclamations but through the gradual accumulation of small habits and shared practices and overlapping relationships until, one day, someone looks around and notices that what was several things has become one thing, not because anyone made it so, but because that is simply the direction in which things were moving all along. The landscape itself was changing during these centuries, though slowly, in the way that all inhabited landscapes change under the patient pressure of human use. Trees were cleared from the lower slopes for farmland and for building timber. The river valley was gradually drained and leveled in places. Paths that people walked repeatedly hardened and widened into tracks, and tracks connected to other tracks, and the network of connection between the hills and the river and the land beyond began to take on a shape that would, over very long stretches of time, become the shape of a city. Water was important, as it always is in the life of a settlement. The Tiber provided it, but the Tiber also flooded, and its floods were unpredictable and sometimes severe. The springs on the hillsides provided cleaner, more reliable water, and these springs were sacred, not in a distant or abstract way, but in the immediate, practical sense that sacred things in ancient life often were, things that kept you alive being naturally and straightforwardly treated as gifts of the divine. The spring on the Palatine, the spring on the Capitoline, the spring that fed the valley that would become the Forum, these were tended and honored the way anything essential and precious is honored by people who understand what it means to live without. The forests beyond the hills provided timber and charcoal, and the wild products of the woodland, nuts and berries and game and honey from the hives of wild bees. The grasslands provided pasture. The river provided fish and the soft clay of its banks for making pottery. The landscape around the Tiber ford was, in short, a landscape of quiet sufficiency, a place where life could be lived and sustained without great difficulty, where the seasons came and went, and the work of each season was done, and the community continued, generation after generation, in the steady, unhurried rhythm of agricultural life. It is worth resting in this image for a moment, the image of these hilltop communities in their earliest centuries, before the Forum, before the temples, before the roads and the legions and the vast administrative machinery of an empire. These are people sitting by small fires in the evening, watching the last light fade from the hills across the river, listening to the sound of cattle settling for the night, feeling the warmth of the hearth against the cooling of the autumn air. Their world is small and familiar and dense with the particular details of daily life, the smell of bread baking on a clay hearth, the sound of a child being called in from the dark, the rough texture of a woolen cloak pulled close against the chill. They do not know that what they are building in this slow and unhurried way will one day be called the center of the world. They are simply living. They are simply here on their hills, beside their river, in the quiet of an ancient evening. The Etruscans, living to the north and exercising a significant cultural influence on the early Latin communities, were in many ways more sophisticated than their neighbors to the south in these early centuries. They built in stone. They had a complex religious system with a substantial body of written texts. They were accomplished metalworkers, producing bronze and iron objects of considerable refinement. They traded widely across the Mediterranean, exchanging goods with Greek merchants and with the peoples of the eastern seas. Their art, which covers the walls of their painted tombs in scenes of feasting and dancing and athletic competition, has a lively quality, a delight in the sensory pleasures of existence, that speaks of a culture at ease with its own prosperity and deeply aware of the pleasures available in a comfortable life. The influence of Etruscan culture on early Rome is difficult to measure precisely, but it is clearly substantial. The word Etruria does not simply name a territory. It names a cultural world whose edges bled southward into Latium and into the life of the communities along the Tiber. Certain aspects of Roman religion, certain architectural forms, certain practices of divination and ritual carry strong Etruscan fingerprints. The toga, that most Roman of garments, may well have Etruscan origins. The practice of reading the future in the entrails of sacrificed animals was certainly borrowed from or shared with Etruscan religious tradition. The alphabet with which Latin was eventually written down was derived from the Greek alphabet by way of the Etruscans, who had themselves adapted it from Greek colonists in the south of Italy. Even the name of the city, Roma, may have Etruscan roots, connected to an Etruscan family name or to an Etruscan word for the river. To the south and along the coasts, the Greek colonies were another powerful presence in the world of early Rome. Cities like Cumae, established on the coast not far south of the Tiber mouth, were flourishing centers of trade and culture well before Rome had consolidated itself into anything resembling a proper city. The Greeks brought with them the vine and the olive, crops that would gradually spread northward through the Italian peninsula. They brought the mythology that Rome would eventually absorb and adapt, giving Greek names to gods who had already existed in Italian religious life, layering Greek stories over local ones until the two became difficult to separate. They brought philosophical ideas and artistic conventions that would become foundational to Roman intellectual and aesthetic life. The world into which Rome was born was, in short, a world full of other worlds, a complex landscape of peoples and cultures and languages and religious traditions, all in slow conversation with one another, all influencing and being influenced, all part of a Mediterranean world that was already, in these early centuries, far more connected and far more various than any simple account of it can suggest. Rome was not born in isolation. It was born in the middle of things, at a crossing point between north and south, between the Latin and the Etruscan, between the local and the distant, between the familiar and the new. And the river kept moving, as rivers do, carrying its slow brown cargo of soil and time from the hills to the sea, indifferent to the small bright lives happening along its banks, indifferent to the huts on the hilltops and the fires in the hearths and the children growing up in the shadow of the hills, not knowing, not needing to know, that the world was gradually and quietly rearranging itself around them into something that would one day carry their name across the whole of the known earth. The Tiber bends here. The hills rise gently in the soft light. A thin smoke rises from a hearth somewhere on the Palatine. A shepherd moves slowly across a hillside, his animals drifting before him, the way clouds drift across a quiet sky. This is where it begins. Quietly, without announcement, without drama, simply here in this place, in this light, with the sound of the river below and the smell of the earth all around, and the long, unhurried centuries lying ahead like a road disappearing slowly into the distance, into the soft and fading light of time. There is something quietly reassuring about the idea of a king. Not a king in the grand and overwhelming sense, not a figure of terrifying power and distant magnificence, but a king in the older, simpler sense, a person who stands at the center of a community and holds it together the way a hearthstone holds the warmth of a fire, not by force alone, but by presence, by familiarity, by the accumulated weight of custom and recognition. The earliest kings of Rome were this kind of figure, or so the Romans remembered them, or so they wished to remember them, which may amount to the same thing in the end. They were shepherds of a community still finding its shape, men whose authority was measured not in the vastness of their territories, but in the depth of their roots, in the quiet steadiness of their presence among their people. Rome, in the tradition that the Romans themselves preserved and repeated across many centuries, had 7 kings. 7 is a number with a certain symbolic weight, a number that recurs in myth and memory the way certain shapes recur in nature, in the petals of flowers, in the faces of crystals, in the grouping of stars across a dark sky. Whether there were exactly 7 kings, and whether they reigned in precisely the order recorded, and whether the details of their reigns are historical in any strict sense, these are questions that scholars have turned over carefully for a very long time without arriving at final answers. What is certain is that Rome had a period of kingship, that this period lasted several centuries, that during these centuries the community by the Tiber grew and changed and gradually took on the institutional shape that would persist, transformed but recognizable, through all the long ages that followed. The kings, real or legendary or somewhere in the uncertain middle ground between those two categories, were the vessel in which that transformation happened. The first king, Romulus, we have already met in the previous chapter standing on the Palatine Hill, drawing his sacred line in the earth, naming his city and beginning its story. Whatever Romulus was in historical reality, in Roman memory he was the founder, the originator, the man who made the first decision and set everything in motion. His reign, as the Romans remembered it, was concerned with the most fundamental problems of a new community. The problem of people, the problem of women, the problem of law, the problem of neighbors. The problem of people was this: a new settlement needs inhabitants, and inhabitants are not always easy to come by. The Romans remembered that Romulus dealt with this by declaring the Palatine Hill a place of asylum, a sanctuary where men fleeing trouble could come and find safety and a new beginning. Runaway slaves, exiled men, wanderers without a home, all were welcome within the new walls of Roma, and all, by accepting that welcome, became Romans. There is something quietly democratic about this memory, something that speaks to a genuine feature of Roman civic identity in later centuries: the remarkable openness of Rome to outsiders, the willingness to absorb and incorporate and eventually naturalize the peoples it encountered, the sense that being Roman was a matter of participation and commitment rather than of birth alone. The asylum on the Palatine is, in this reading, a mythological expression of something real about the Roman character, a story that captures a truth even if its details are not literally true. The problem of women was related to the problem of people, a community of men, and the asylum, in the tradition, attracted men rather than families, could not sustain itself across generations without women. The Romans remembered that Romulus invited the neighboring Sabine people to a festival, and that during the festival the Roman men took the Sabine women as their wives, carrying them away in a scene that Roman storytellers depicted with varying degrees of force and varying degrees of mutual willingness. The rape of the Sabine women, as this episode is called in later tellings, is a story that has made audiences uncomfortable in many ages, and rightly so. But beneath the disturbing surface of the story there is a historical reality of a quieter kind. The early Roman community was made up of multiple groups, Latin and Sabine and perhaps Etruscan elements, and the merging of these groups through intermarriage and shared life was a real process, slow and gradual, that happened over many generations. The Sabine women who became Roman wives, and the Sabine families who followed them into Roman life, and the Sabine men who eventually set aside their grievances and joined the community. All of this speaks to the process by which the separate hilltop communities of the early Tiber Valley gradually became one people. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, is said to have ruled alongside Romulus for a time in a kind of dual kingship, the two men sharing authority over their merged communities in an arrangement that is unusual and interesting, and perhaps not entirely legendary. The idea of shared power, of the necessity of consultation and consent, of authority distributed rather than concentrated. These are themes that will recur throughout Roman history in various forms, as if the memory of that early arrangement left a permanent mark on the Roman political imagination. Romulus, in the tradition, did not die in any ordinary way. He disappeared during a storm, or was taken up into the sky, or was killed by discontented senators, and his body quietly disposed of. The accounts differ, each version expressing something different about how the community felt about the ending of the kingly age. He was worshipped afterward as the god Quirinus, a deity of the Roman people, a divine ancestor to whom the community could look back with a mixture of gratitude and reverence. The deification of Romulus is the first of many moments in Roman history when the line between the human and the divine became pleasantly blurred, when the community found it natural and comforting to imagine its great figures as having passed beyond ordinary mortality into something larger and more lasting. After Romulus came Numa Pompilius, and with Numa the tone of the kingship changes entirely. Where Romulus had been a warrior and a founder, a man of action and expansion, Numa was a man of peace and religion, a gentle and scholarly figure who spent his reign not fighting wars but building the religious and ceremonial structures of Roman life. The Romans remembered him as wise and quiet and deeply learned in the ways of the gods, a man who communed with a divine nymph named Egeria by the side of a spring outside the city, receiving from her the sacred knowledge he needed to set Roman religion on its proper foundations. Numa, in the tradition, established the calendar of religious festivals that governed Roman life through all the centuries that followed. He organized the priestly colleges, the flamines, who were priests dedicated to particular gods, the pontiffs, who managed the sacred law, the augurs, who read the will of the gods in the flight of birds and the behavior of sacred chickens, the Vestal virgins, who tended the sacred flame of the hearth of Rome in the circular temple by the Forum. Each of these institutions would last, in various forms, for a very long time. The Vestal virgins tended their flame for nearly 1,000 years after Numa's time. There is something deeply peaceful about imagining this, the flame burning quietly through all the changes and upheavals of Roman history, tended by its priestesses in their white robes, a small constant warmth at the center of the great restless city. The calendar that Numa established divided the year into months named for gods and seasonal events, and prescribed for each day a character, days that were suitable for legal and political business, days that were sacred and set aside, days that fell in between. The rhythm of the Roman year under this calendar was a rhythm of alternation, of activity and rest, of the secular and the sacred interleaving like the fingers of two hands folded together. Every Roman going about daily life was aware, at every moment, of where they stood in this sacred calendar, of which days were auspicious and which were not, of the approaching festival and the recent one just past. Time itself was organized and meaningful, shaped by religious observance into something more than a simple succession of undifferentiated days. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, was in the tradition the opposite of Numa in temperament, warlike where Numa was peaceful, outward-looking where Numa had been inward and contemplative. His reign is associated in Roman memory with the destruction of Alba Longa, the old Latin city from which Rome's legendary founders had come, the city of Aeneas's descendants and Romulus's ancestors. The story of how this happened is told with a certain quiet drama that the Romans found satisfying, two communities agreeing to settle their dispute through a contest of champions rather than a general battle. Three brothers from Rome called the Horatii facing three brothers from Alba called the Curiatii on a field between the two armies. Two of the Roman brothers died. The last surviving Horatius, wounded and pursued by the three surviving Alban champions, turned and killed them one by one as they struggled to keep up with him, their own wounds slowing them. Rome won. Alba was absorbed. Its people were brought to Rome and settled on the Caelian hill, and the population of the city grew by another measure. This story of the Horta and Curiatii is one of those Roman tales that is almost certainly not literally true in its details, but that captures something real in its structure. The real process by which Rome gradually absorbed its Latin neighbors, not always by outright conquest, sometimes by treaty and alliance and the slow drawing of others into the Roman orbit, but inexorably, steadily, the way the tide moves across a beach, filling each small hollow and channel in turn. Alba Longa was real. Its absorption into Roman dominance was real. The particular story told about it is the myth that memory wove around the fact. The fourth king, Ancus Marcius, was remembered as a builder and an organizer, a man who extended Roman power down toward the sea, establishing the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. Or so the tradition said, though the archaeology of Ostia suggests a somewhat later foundation. Whether or not Ancus literally built Ostia, the reign attributed to him represents a real moment of Roman expansion in the direction of the sea, a turning of Roman attention toward the wider world of Mediterranean trade. The Tiber road to the sea was important, and would remain important, as a conduit for the goods and ideas that flowed in and out of the growing city. Salt especially, that most essential of preservatives, that most basic of commodities in a world before refrigeration, came up from the salt flats at the Tiber mouth along a road that would later be called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, one of the oldest routes in Latium. With the fifth king, Tarquinius Priscus, the Etruscan influence on Rome becomes unmistakable and explicit. Tarquinius, in the tradition, was the son of a Corinthian Greek who had settled in the Etruscan city of Tarquinii, and he came to Rome as an outsider who had heard that the city offered opportunity to the talented and the ambitious. He arrived, according to the story, with his wife Tranquil in a wagon, and as they reached the Janiculum hill across the Tiber from Rome, an eagle swooped down and took his cap from his head, circled high above, and then descended again and replaced it. Tranquil, who was skilled in Etruscan divination, interpreted this omen as a sign that her husband would rise to the highest position in the city below. And so, the story goes, he did. What this legend captures in its colorful way is a real historical truth, that the early Roman kings included at least one, and perhaps more than one, figure of Etruscan origin or Etruscan cultural formation, and that this Etruscan kingship left deep marks on the city. The great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, one of the defining sacred structures of Roman religion, was begun during the Tarquin dynasty and was built in the Etruscan style, with terracotta decorations and a high podium and the characteristic triple cell for three deities, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, a divine triad that may itself reflect an Etruscan religious arrangement. The circus in which chariot races were held, the great Circus Maximus in the valley between the Palatine and the Aventine, was associated with Tarquinius Priscus in the Roman tradition, another gift of the Etruscan kings to Roman civic life. Tarquinius Priscus was also credited in the tradition with beginning the great sewer of Rome, the Cloaca Maxima, which drained the marshy valley that would become the Forum and made it habitable ground. If there is a single engineering achievement that made Rome possible as a city, it may be this one, the patient, unglamorous work of drainage, of diverting the water that collected between the hills and sending it away through a great arched tunnel to the river. The Cloaca Maxima still exists, still flows, still carries the water of Rome to the Tiber as it has done for something like 2,500 years. There is something quietly wonderful about that continuity, that unbroken thread of practical function linking the ancient city to the present day. The drains of the old city still doing what they were built to do, still keeping the ground dry beneath feet that walk on streets built on the memory of streets. The sixth king, Servius Tullius, is in many ways the most interesting figure of the kingly period, at least from the perspective of Roman institutional history. He was remembered as a reformer and an organizer, a man who took the informal and organic social arrangements of the early community and gave them a more deliberate and systematic shape. The census attributed to him, the systematic counting and classifying of the Roman people, was one of the foundational acts of Roman civic life. The census divided the population into classes based on wealth, and those classes determined military obligation, voting rights, and social standing. It was, in its quiet bureaucratic way, a revolutionary act, the transformation of a community of individuals into a structured society with defined places and defined responsibilities. The classes Servius established were organized around the ownership of land and the ability to equip oneself for military service. Those with the most land formed the first class and served as heavy infantry in the best armor. Those with less formed the lower classes, serving in lighter roles or supporting roles. At the bottom were those with nothing, the proletariat, a word that meant, literally, those who contributed nothing to the state but their offspring. This classification was not purely theoretical. It had real consequences in the assemblies, the gatherings at which the Roman people voted and made collective decisions. In the assembly organized by centuries, the comitia centuriata, the votes of the upper classes carried more weight than the votes of the lower classes, and the wealthy could, if they voted together, outvote everyone else. This was an aristocratic arrangement wearing the clothes of popular government, and it would remain a source of tension in Roman political life for centuries. But Servius also built the walls. The great circuit of walls attributed to him, the Servian Wall, as it is called, though the surviving remains are largely of 4th century construction, enclosed a far larger area than had previously been considered part of the city, drawing within its embrace all 7 hills and the valleys between them. Whether Servius literally built these walls, or whether the tradition of his building them simply preserves a memory of the period when Rome's boundaries were first formally and durably defined. The walls themselves speak to a city that had grown beyond the simple hilltop settlement of earlier centuries and was now a substantial place, a place worth defending, a place whose outline had become definite and intentional. The seventh and last king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, is in the Roman tradition the dark conclusion of the kingly age, the figure whose overreaching and arrogance made the end of kingship feel not just possible but necessary and welcome. Where the first Tarquin had been an immigrant who won his position through talent and charm, Tarquinius Superbus was a man who seized power through violence, killing his predecessor, refusing to bury him, ruling without consulting the Senate, treating the citizens of Rome with contempt and the laws of Rome with indifference. His name, Superbus, meaning proud or arrogant, is almost certainly not his real name, but a label applied by later tradition, the shorthand of historical memory that collapses a complex person into their defining quality as they are remembered. The story that ends his reign is the story of Lucretia, and it is one of the most quietly terrible stories in Roman history. Lucretia was a Roman noblewoman, known for her virtue and her domestic goodness. The tradition remembers her as the ideal of Roman womanhood, found by her husband and his companions when they returned unexpectedly from a campaign, sitting in her house late at night doing her weaving, while the wives of other nobles were found at parties or in idleness. Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, was so impressed by her virtue that he later came to her house alone, and by force and threat took from her what she had not offered. The next morning, Lucretia summoned her father and her husband and told them what had happened, and then killed herself, unable to bear the shame that Roman culture placed upon a woman who had been violated, regardless of her will in the matter. The death of Lucretia, which is, from any humane perspective, a tragedy and an injustice, the final suffering of a woman wronged twice over, first by violence, and then by a culture that could offer her no other way forward, became in Roman memory and Roman political mythology the spark that ended the kingship. Lucius Junius Brutus, a man who had spent years playing the fool in order to avoid the fate that had overtaken other members of his family at the hands of the Tarquins, displayed the body of Lucretia to the people of Rome, called for an end to the monarchy, and led the expulsion of the Tarquin family from the city. The kings were gone. They would not return. The word rex, king, became in Roman political culture a word of contamination, something almost dangerous to speak in certain contexts, a word that carried in it the memory of arrogance and the end of freedom. It is worth pausing here, in the quietness of this moment between one age and another, to consider what the kingly period had actually accomplished, setting aside the legends and the moral lessons and the political mythology. When the kings came, Rome was a small community of hilltop settlements sharing a river crossing. When the kings went, Rome was a city with walls, with temples, with a drained and organized forum, with a system of religious institutions and priestly colleges, with a classified and counted citizenry, with a military organization, with a sewer and a circus, and a tradition of public building that would continue and expand for centuries. The kings, whatever their individual characters, had presided over the transformation of a village into a city. They had also, and perhaps more importantly, given Rome its language of government, the vocabulary of authority and consent, the distinction between legal and illegal power, the understanding that even a king ruled within limits and that those limits, when crossed, justified resistance. The Roman tradition of the good king and the bad king, of Numa's piety and Tarquin's pride, is not merely biographical. It is constitutional in the deepest sense of that word. It constitutes, it defines, it establishes in the collective memory of the community what power is for and what it is not for, what its proper exercise looks like and what its abuse looks like. These lessons, absorbed through generations of storytelling and annual festival, and the civic rituals that kept the past alive in the present, were part of what made Rome Rome, the particular and persistent sense that authority was a trust, not a possession, and that those who forgot that distinction eventually lost everything. The hills are quiet in the evening. The Forum Valley, newly drained, newly paved in its earliest rough form, lies still in the fading light. The great temple on the Capitoline Hill, its terracotta decorations bright against the darkening sky, looks out over the bend of the Tiber. Fires burn in the houses on the hillsides. The Vestal flame burns in its small circular temple, as it has burned since Numa set it there, as it will burn for centuries yet to come. The kings are gone, the city remains. What comes next is long and slow and full of the ordinary work of a people learning to govern themselves. The patient, unhurried construction of institutions and laws and habits of mind that will carry Rome from this quiet hilltop city to something the world has not yet imagined, something so vast and so durable that its echoes will reach forward through time to a world the Romans themselves could never have conceived of or described. But that is still ahead, still distant, still dissolving softly in the long light of the future. For now the fires burn low, the river moves, the night comes down slowly over the 7 hills and the city rests. There is a particular quality to the light in early morning, before the city fully wakes. It comes slowly, the way all good things come slowly. First a softening of the darkness at the eastern edges of the sky, then a gentle suffusion of gray that is not quite light but is no longer dark. Then gradually, unhurriedly, the first warm tones of gold and amber spreading across the hilltops, catching the upper walls of the temples, lying in long, quiet strips across the paving stones of the forum below. The birds begin before the light arrives. They begin in the trees on the Aventine and the Esquiline, small voices in the darkness, and their sound spreads gradually across the city, the way ripples spread across still water when a leaf falls into it, outward and outward, growing softer as they go, until the whole air is filled with that gentle, directionless sound of morning. This is the city of the Republic. It is a city that wakes early and works steadily and rests in the afternoon heat and gathers again in the evening. A city organized around the rhythms of agricultural life, even as it grows beyond those rhythms. A city that carries in its bones the memory of the fields and the seasons even as it becomes something larger and more complex and more difficult to hold in a single image. It is a city of routines, and routines are a form of comfort, a way of organizing the uncertain world into something that can be anticipated and prepared for and understood. The republic that replaced the kingship in 509 BCE, or near enough to that year, which is itself a figure calculated backward through uncertain centuries, was not born fully formed. It was not a system that someone designed and then implemented according to a plan. It was like the city itself, a thing that grew gradually, that accumulated its features over time, that added institutions and laws and customs as needs arose and as conflicts demanded resolution, and as the community slowly worked out, through long practice, what it needed to sustain itself. The Republic was less a constitution than a conversation. A very long, very slow conversation among the Roman people about how they wished to live together, and who should have what kind of say in the decisions that affected them all. The most basic feature of the new arrangement was the replacement of the single king with 2 magistrates called consuls, elected annually, each with the power to veto the decisions of the other. This was the foundational Roman insight about power, that it should be divided, that it should be temporary, that it should check itself. The annual election meant that no man could hold power long enough to entrench himself beyond removal. The veto, the Latin word simply meaning I forbid, meant that no man could act alone without the possibility of being stopped by his equal. These 2 principles, collegiality and annuality, ran through the entire structure of republican government like threads through cloth, giving it its characteristic texture, its resistance to the concentration of authority in any single pair of hands. The consuls were the summit of a hierarchy of magistracies that developed gradually across the early centuries of the Republic. Below the consuls were the praetors, who handled legal matters and could command armies when needed. Below them were the censors, elected every 5 years to conduct the census and manage the moral supervision of the community, a role that sounds austere and perhaps uncomfortable, but that was in practice largely administrative. The maintenance of the citizen rolls, the letting of public contracts, the oversight of public buildings and roads and aqueducts. Below the censors were the aediles, responsible for the maintenance of the city itself, the streets and the markets and the temples and the water supply, the practical management of urban life in all its mundane and essential detail. And at the base of the magistrate hierarchy were the quaestors, financial officers who managed the public treasury and assisted senior magistrates in their administrative work. Each of these offices had its own particular dignity, its own set of powers and limitations, its own place in the carefully maintained hierarchy of Roman public life. The sequence of offices, the cursus honorum, the course of honors, was the path that an ambitious Roman man followed through his public life, moving upward through the ranks as he aged and accumulated experience and reputation, each office preparing him for the next, each stage of advancement bringing greater responsibility and greater visibility and greater opportunity for the kind of public service that was, in the Roman understanding, the proper purpose of a man's life. To serve the Republic was not merely a civic duty. It was, in the deepest sense, what it meant to be fully human, to be fully Roman, to participate in the great ongoing project of the community's life. At the summit of this system, above even the consuls in a certain sense, sat the Senate. The Senate was not, technically, a governing body in the modern sense. It could not pass laws on its own authority. It could not issue commands directly to the citizens. What it could do was issue recommendations, the Senatus Consultum, the Council of the Senate, and in practice those recommendations carried a weight so great, so thoroughly entrenched in Roman custom and expectation, that they functioned as something very close to law. The Senate was the repository of Roman collective wisdom, the assembled experience of the men who had held office and fought wars and managed provinces and negotiated treaties, and its recommendations reflected that experience in a way that was difficult to argue with, not because argument was forbidden, but because the authority of accumulated experience has a gravity of its own that is hard to resist. The Senate met in the Curia, a rectangular building on the edge of the Forum, and its meetings had a particular character, slow, formal, attentive to precedent and procedure in a way that could seem ponderous from the outside, but that served important purposes within. Senators spoke in a fixed order, from the most senior to the most junior, and each man spoke at whatever length he judged necessary, which sometimes meant at very great length indeed. The proceedings were governed by rules that had accumulated over generations, rules about when business could be conducted and when it could not, about the proper forms of address and the proper way to record decisions, and the proper procedure for expressing dissent. These rules were not obstacles to business. They were the form that business took, the way that the weight of the past was brought to bear on the decisions of the present, the way that the community's accumulated wisdom was made present and active in every deliberation. The people themselves, the Roman citizens in their various assemblies, also had a role in the republican system, though a role that was more complicated and more contested than it might appear at first glance. The assemblies voted on laws, elected magistrates, and decided on war and peace. But the assemblies were organized in ways that gave greater effective power to the wealthier classes, and the agenda of the assemblies was set by the magistrates who called them, not by the people themselves. The Roman Republic was a system in which popular participation was real but constrained, in which the voice of the people was heard but heard through filters that softened it, slowed it, gave the established interests of the senatorial class time to respond and adjust. This imbalance was the source of the great internal tension that ran through all the centuries of the Republic. The conflict between the patricians and the plebeians, between the established aristocracy and the rest of the citizen body. The patricians were the old families, the clans whose names had been recorded in the earliest citizen rolls, whose ancestors had sat in the Senate under the kings, who claimed by birth and custom a privileged access to religious office and political authority that the newer and lower families did not share. The plebeians were everyone else, a category that included the very poor and the moderately comfortable, and, in time, the genuinely wealthy families who had risen through commerce or military success, but who lacked the ancient patrician pedigree. The conflict between these two groups, the struggle of the orders, as historians call it, was one of the defining features of the early and middle republic. It was not a conflict of sudden violence or dramatic confrontation, for the most part. It was a slow, patient, persistent negotiation conducted over generations, in which the plebeians gradually won concessions from the patricians through a combination of collective action and legal argument and the simple arithmetic of need. The Republic needed its plebeian soldiers to fight its wars, and soldiers who feel unjustly treated fight with less enthusiasm than soldiers who feel they have something worth fighting for. The great weapon of the plebeians in this struggle was the secession, the collective withdrawal of the plebeian population from the city to a hill outside its boundaries, a form of strike action so fundamental and so alarming to the patricians that it forced negotiation every time it happened. The first secession, in the tradition dated to 494 BCE, resulted in the creation of the tribunes of the plebs, magistrates elected by the plebeians specifically to protect plebeian interests, magistrates whose persons were declared sacrosanct, and whose power of veto, the intercessio, could be used to block the actions of any other magistrate. The tribunes were, in the delicate balance of the republican system, the counterweight to senatorial and patrician authority, the institutional voice of the majority, the proof that the system could bend without breaking. Over the following 2 centuries, the plebeians won further concessions, each one a small step on a long road. The 12 Tables, a codification of Roman law inscribed on bronze tablets and displayed in the Forum around 450 BCE, made the law accessible and visible in a way it had not been when it existed only in the private knowledge of patrician priests and magistrates. The Licinian section laws of 367 BCE opened the consulship to plebeians, breaking the patrician monopoly on the highest office. The Hortensian law of 287 BCE gave the votes of the plebeian assembly the full force of law binding on all Romans, patricians included. Each of these steps was the result of long argument, long pressure, long patience, the slow grinding of the millstone of democratic aspiration against the hard surface of entrenched privilege, producing not a revolution, but a gradual and imperfect expansion of the circle of the fully empowered. The Rome of the Middle Republic was a city of expanding physical presence, growing steadily beyond the boundaries of the Servian Wall as the population increased and the wealth of conquest flowed in. The streets were narrow and winding in the older quarters, following the natural contours of the hills, paved with large, irregular stones worn smooth by generations of feet and hooves and cartwheels. The buildings pressed close on either side, workshops at street level, apartments above, the upper stories sometimes projecting outward so that the strip of sky visible between them narrowed to a thin blue line far above. The smell of the city was the smell of all ancient cities, dense and layered wood smoke and cooking food and animals, and the effluent of close-packed human life, but also the smell of fresh bread from the bakeries, and the sharp green smell of vegetables in the market stalls, and the warm, dusty smell of stone in summer sun. The Forum was the heart of this city, as it had been since the valley was first drained and leveled in the days of the kings. By the Middle Republic it was a place of considerable complexity, not the open space its name might suggest, but a dense environment of temples and law courts and market stalls and the rostra, the speaking platform decorated with the bronze rams taken from captured enemy ships, from which the orators and magistrates addressed the assembled citizens. The temples rose around the edges of the Forum on their high podia, the Temple of Saturn, which housed the public treasury, the Temple of Castor and Pollux, commemorating the twin gods who were said to have appeared at the Battle of Lake Regillus to fight for Rome, the round Temple of Vesta, where the eternal flame still burned under the care of the Vestals. Each temple was a landmark and a memory, a three-dimensional record of a moment in the city's history when something had been vowed to a god, and the vow had been kept. The sacred calendar that Numa had established gave the year its rhythm, and that rhythm was felt throughout every level of Roman life. The great festivals punctuated the months the way the festivals of an agricultural year have always punctuated human life, with ceremony and gathering, and the temporary suspension of ordinary routine, with processions through the streets and sacrifices at the temples and games in the circus, and the simple communal pleasure of a people doing together what they do separately on most days. The Lupercalia in February, when priests ran through the streets striking people with strips of hide, in a rite of purification that was already ancient beyond memory in the Middle Republic. The Floralia in April and May, celebrating the flowering of the season with games and flowers, and a loosening of the usual social constraints. The Ludi Romani in September, the great games held in honor of Jupiter, with chariot races in the Circus Maximus and theatrical performances and processions that wound through the streets of the city with a slow, magnificent wait. The chariot races deserve a moment of attention, because they were perhaps the most purely and intensely Roman form of public pleasure, the spectacle that most completely expressed something essential about the Roman temperament: the love of competition, the passion for speed and skill, the communal experience of thousands of people sharing a single moment of intensity. The Circus Maximus, that long oval track in the valley between the Palatine and the Aventine, could hold an astonishing number of spectators. Ancient sources give figures in the hundreds of thousands, which may be exaggerated but which speak to a genuine experience of collective immensity, of being part of a crowd so large that the crowd itself becomes a kind of landscape. The teams were distinguished by colors, the blues and the greens and the reds and the whites, and the loyalties they inspired cut across all other social divisions, uniting patrician and plebeian, free and slave, Roman and foreigner in the simple, uncomplicated passion of partisanship. The wars of the early and Middle Republic were not distant affairs, conducted by professional soldiers far from the daily life of the city. They were close, frequent, and personally felt. Rome in its early centuries was surrounded by peoples who were not friends. The Equi and the Volsci in the hills to the south and east, the Etruscans to the north, the Latin communities that were sometimes allies and sometimes rivals, the Samnites of the central and southern Apennines who would prove among the most formidable of all Rome's Italian opponents. The Roman army that fought these wars was a citizen army, a force of farmers and craftsmen and small landowners who took up their weapons when the season called for it and returned to their fields when the campaign was over. The military system was organized along the same class lines as the political system, the wealthier citizens serving as cavalry and heavy infantry, the less wealthy serving in lighter roles, the whole force divided into centuries that were both military units and voting units, the same organization serving the dual purposes of fighting and deciding. The legion, the fundamental unit of Roman military organization, was not yet in the early republic the highly drilled and disciplined force it would become in later centuries. It was a more flexible and improvised thing, learning through experience, adapting its tactics to the varied terrains and opponents it encountered, developing through practice the particular combination of discipline and initiative that would eventually make it so formidable. The Samnite Wars, fought across 3 long conflicts spanning most of the 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE, were the crucible in which the Roman legion was forged into its mature form. The Samnites were mountain fighters of considerable skill, organized in a different way from the Greek-influenced phalanx that Rome had initially used, and the terrain of their country, the steep ridges and narrow valleys of the central Apennines, did not favor the rigid close-order fighting of the phalanx. Rome lost badly enough, often enough, that it was forced to think carefully about how it fought, to break its formations into smaller, more maneuverable units, to develop the manipular legion with its 3 lines of infantry arranged by age and experience, each line capable of acting with a degree of independence that the phalanx did not permit. The disaster at the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, when a Roman army was trapped in a mountain pass by the Samnites and forced to pass under a yoke of spears in the ultimate expression of military humiliation, was the kind of event that Rome absorbed and remembered and learned from in the slow, thorough way that genuine institutional learning happens. The shame of it lasted for generations in Roman memory. The lessons it taught about terrain and intelligence, and the dangers of overconfidence lasted equally long, embodied in the way the army trained and the way commanders thought about their campaigns. The domestic life of the Roman citizen ran alongside this public and military life, in the quiet, steady rhythm that domestic life everywhere tends to maintain regardless of what is happening in the world beyond the household walls. The Roman house, the domus, was organized around the atrium, a central room open to the sky through a rectangular aperture in the roof, beneath which sat a shallow pool that collected rainwater. Around the atrium, the other rooms of the house were arranged, opening onto it the way rooms in a cloister open onto a courtyard, the whole organization expressing the Roman instinct for order and enclosure, for the making of a defined and protected domestic world within the larger and less controllable world of the city. The paterfamilias, the father of the family, was in Roman law a figure of remarkable authority, holding over the members of his household a power that was, theoretically, absolute. He could arrange his children's marriages, control their property, and in the earliest law even exercise the power of life and death over his dependents. In practice, this theoretical absolutism was softened by custom and affection, and the social pressure of a community that watched and judged the behavior of its members closely. Roman fathers were not, in the historical record, monsters of arbitrary power. They were men operating within a cultural understanding of family life that placed great emphasis on duty and continuity, and the proper transmission of name and property and religious obligation from one generation to the next. The women of Rome in the Republic lived lives that were constrained by law and custom in ways that it is important not to minimize, but that were also richer and more various than a simple account of legal disability might suggest. Roman women of the propertied classes managed households of considerable complexity, overseeing the work of slaves and freedmen, controlling the education of children, maintaining the domestic religious observances that were as important to Roman religious life as the grand public rites in the forum temples. Some women, through the accidents of inheritance and the particular arrangements of Roman property law, controlled substantial wealth. Some exerted significant informal influence through the social networks of elite Roman life, through the relationships they maintained, and the information they gathered, and the opinions they expressed in the domestic setting where so much of Roman political life was actually conducted. The slaves who worked in Roman households and on Roman farms and in Roman workshops were a presence so ubiquitous and so fundamental to the Roman economy that it is impossible to describe Roman life accurately without them, and yet so normalized that Roman writers rarely pause to describe them directly, the way one rarely pauses to describe the furniture in a familiar room. They came from the edges of the Roman world and then from beyond it, taken in wars or purchased in markets or born into slavery within Roman households. Their lives varied enormously depending on their skills, their owners, their luck. A skilled Greek tutor in a wealthy household and a laborer in the silver mines of Spain were both, legally, slaves, but their daily experiences had almost nothing in common. Roman slavery was brutal in its foundations and variable in its expressions, a system that produced both the occasional freed slave who rose to wealth and influence, and the nameless thousands whose lives were simply consumed in the service of others. The countryside around Rome was the foundation on which all the rest rested, the source of the grain and wine and oil and meat and timber, and stone that the city required, the home of the majority of Roman citizens who were farmers rather than city dwellers, the landscape that shaped the Roman imagination in ways that persisted long after most Romans had ceased to have any direct connection to agricultural life. The Roman love of the land was real and deep and persistent. It expressed itself in poetry and philosophy, and the agricultural treatises that educated Romans wrote for one another. And it expressed itself in the calendar and in the festivals and in the religious observances that marked the turning of the seasons, and asked the gods for rain and good harvests and protection from disease. The farms of the Middle Republic were mostly modest in size, the holdings of citizen soldiers, men who worked their own land with their own hands and perhaps a slave or two, who grew enough to eat and enough to sell at the city markets, and who maintained the small household religious observances of a farming family with the same quiet fidelity that they maintained their fields. The figure of the Roman farmer-soldier, the man who put down his plow to take up his sword, and then returned to the plow when the war was over, was an ideal deeply embedded in Roman self-understanding, a figure of simplicity and virtue and practical competence, uncorrupted by luxury, unswayed by fashion, rooted in the actual substance of the world in a way that city life could not provide. The most famous embodiment of this ideal was Cincinnatus, the man who was called from his plowing to serve as dictator, the emergency magistrate appointed in times of crisis with near-absolute powers, defeated Rome's enemies in a brief campaign, and then returned his powers to the Senate and went back to his farm, all within a matter of weeks. Whether the historical Cincinnatus was quite this straightforwardly noble is impossible to know. What is certain is that Rome needed this story, returned to it constantly, made it a touchstone of the Republican ideal, the idea that power should be held lightly, used for its purpose, and then laid down without regret. Evening comes to the city slowly, as it always does in summer, the light holding long after the day's work is done, turning golden and then amber, and then the deep warm rose of Roman sunsets, which have a particular quality in that latitude and that landscape, the light catching the dust in the air and giving everything a soft, slightly unreal radiance. The forum empties gradually as the light fades. The market stalls are packed away. The last conversations of the day drift on the warm air. The smoke from the evening fires rises from the hilltop houses in thin, pale columns against the darkening sky. The city rests into its evening habits. The children are called in from the streets. The oil lamps are lit in the atria of the larger houses, casting their warm, unsteady light across the painted walls and the household shrine where the family's Lares, the protecting spirits of the home, stand in their small niches, garlanded with flowers placed there that morning by the first person awake in the house, as they are garlanded every morning, as they have been garlanded every morning within memory. The Republic breathes. It is not a perfect thing. It is not a serene thing. It carries within it all the tensions and contradictions of a society in which equality is an aspiration rather than a reality, in which the powerful and the less powerful are locked in a permanent and unresolved negotiation about the terms of their shared life. But it has a rhythm, and that rhythm is the rhythm of a community that has decided, however imperfectly and however contested that decision may be, to govern itself, to argue and vote and negotiate and compromise and begin again the next day. The flame in the temple of Vesta burns on through the night, small and steady in its circular room. The river moves past the city in the darkness. The hills are quiet under the stars. The Republic endures, as it will endure, through many long and unhurried centuries still to come. There is a quality that belongs to the sea in the early morning, before the wind picks up and before the day's business begins. The water is still and gray and holds the sky in it like a mirror that has been breathed upon, not quite reflecting, not quite its own color, somewhere between the two, a surface that seems to belong neither entirely to the water nor entirely to the sky, but to the quiet space between them. The Mediterranean in these early hours smells of salt and distance, of places far away and routes not yet traveled, of the vast unhurried geography of a sea that connects more shores than any single person can visit in a lifetime. Seabirds move over the water in long, slow arcs, riding the air without effort, their white shapes drifting against the gray like thoughts dissolving at the edge of sleep. Rome came to this sea gradually, as it came to most things, not through a single decision or a single campaign, but through the slow accumulation of circumstances, each one leading naturally and almost inevitably to the next, the way a river finds its way to the sea not through intention, but through the patient following of the lowest ground. For most of the early and middle Republic, Rome had been a land power, its attention directed inland, toward the hills and valleys of the Italian peninsula, toward the neighboring peoples who were close enough to threaten and near enough to absorb. The sea had been someone else's domain, the Greeks in their coastal cities, the Phoenicians from their base at Carthage on the North African coast, the Etruscans in their earlier maritime phase. Rome had looked toward the horizon and seen other people's ships and other people's ambitions, and had turned back to its roads and its fields and its Italian wars. Then slowly, the horizon moved closer. The unification of the Italian peninsula under Roman leadership was not a simple or a clean process. It happened over roughly 3 centuries, from the early wars with Rome's immediate neighbors through the final subjugation of the Samnites and the Greek cities of the south in the early 3rd century BCE. And it happened through a combination of military conquest, diplomatic alliance, and the gradual extension of Roman citizenship, or Latin rights, to defeated peoples that gave them a stake in the Roman project, and drew them into the Roman orbit with bonds that were, if not always freely chosen, at least durable and in many cases genuinely felt. By around 270 BCE, Rome controlled, directly or through alliance, the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po Valley. It was the largest single political unit in the Western Mediterranean, and the sea lay just beyond. The first great confrontation with the wider Mediterranean world came in the form of Carthage, a city on the coast of North Africa, in what is now Tunisia, founded centuries earlier by Phoenician settlers from the eastern Mediterranean coast. Carthage was old when Rome was young, rich when Rome was still building its first stone temples, maritime when Rome had barely learned to build a warship. It controlled the western Mediterranean trade routes with a thoroughness and a confidence that spoke of long establishment, of generations of merchant families who had sailed these waters and knew their currents and their seasonal winds and their profitable harbors. Carthage had settlements and trading posts and spheres of influence stretching from North Africa across to Spain and along the coasts of Sardinia and Sicily, and it had a navy that was among the most capable in the world. Sicily was the place where the Roman world and the Carthaginian world first came into direct and irreconcilable contact. The island lies at the center of the Mediterranean like a stone, in the middle of a ford, unavoidable, strategically essential, the point through which the sea must be crossed if east and west are to be connected. Eastern Sicily had long been the domain of Greek cities, Syracuse above all, one of the greatest cities of the Greek world, a place of philosophers and mathematicians and extraordinary stone temples that still stand, bleached by 2.5 millennia of Mediterranean sun, among the most beautiful ruins in the world. Western Sicily had been the domain of Carthage. The two spheres of influence had maintained a rough and contested equilibrium for generations, broken periodically by wars that neither side quite won, and that left the island divided and wary. When a dispute among Sicilian cities drew Rome into the island's politics in 264 BCE, the Romans found themselves, almost before they had decided to be there, in a position where continuing seemed less costly than withdrawing, and continuing meant confronting Carthage. The First Punic War, Punic from the Latin word for Phoenician, the people from whom the Carthaginians were descended, lasted 23 years, from 264 to 241 BCE, which gives some sense of how substantial an undertaking it was, how far it extended beyond any initial calculation or expectation. The war required Rome to do something it had never seriously done before, to build and operate a fleet capable of fighting Carthage at sea. The Romans were, by their own later admission, novices in naval warfare when this war began. The story is told, perhaps with some embellishment, that they captured a stranded Carthaginian warship and used it as a model, building their fleet while their sailors practiced rowing on benches set up on dry land on the shore. Whether or not this particular detail is accurate, the underlying truth it expresses is real enough. Rome learned naval warfare in the course of fighting a naval war, and learned it quickly enough and thoroughly enough to compete effectively with an opponent that had been building and sailing warships for generations. The Roman solution to the problem of fighting at sea was characteristically practical and characteristically Roman. It found a way to turn a naval battle into something that resembled a land battle, where Roman strengths in disciplined infantry combat could be applied. The corvus was a boarding device, a spiked pole on a rotating arm mounted at the bow of Roman warships, which could be dropped onto an enemy ship when the two vessels came together, locking them in place and allowing Roman legionaries to charge across and fight the enemy crew hand to hand on their own deck. It was an inelegant solution, perhaps, but it worked. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, Rome won its first significant naval victory, and the psychological impact of that victory, of proving that Carthaginian naval supremacy was not invincible, was as important as the military outcome. The First Punic War ground on through 2 decades of sea battles and land campaigns in Sicily and raids on the North African coast and sieges of fortified cities, and the slow, exhausting attrition of two large and determined powers, neither of which could quite bring the other to surrender. Rome lost fleets to storms as often as to enemy action. The sea was as dangerous as Carthage. The sudden winter gales of the Mediterranean as destructive as any Carthaginian admiral. Whole armadas were sunk by weather, tens of thousands of men drowned, and Rome rebuilt and tried again with a patience and a persistence that were among its most characteristic qualities in this period. The war ended in 241 BCE with a Roman victory, a peace treaty that required Carthage to evacuate Sicily and pay a substantial indemnity, and the establishment of Rome's first overseas province. The peace between the First and Second Punic Wars was a piece of preparation, of two powers that had tested each other and were quietly, carefully readying themselves for the next test. Carthage rebuilt its power base in Spain, developing the silver mines of the peninsula, and building an army under the leadership of a family of remarkable military talent, the Barcids, whose most famous member, Hannibal Barca, would prove to be one of the most gifted commanders in the ancient world. Rome consolidated Sicily and then, almost by accident, found itself in possession of Sardinia and Corsica when the Carthaginians, distracted by a mercenary revolt, were unable to resist Roman pressure to cede them. Hannibal crossed the Alps in 218 BCE with an army that included war elephants, those great gray presences moving through the snow and cold of the mountain passes, enormous and improbable, their breath steaming in the thin air. The crossing is one of those images from ancient history that has a quality of the dreamlike about it, a quality of the impossible made actual through sheer determination. The passes were steep and dangerous, and the autumn was turning to winter, and the local alpine tribes were hostile, and the cold was severe. And yet the army came through, diminished but intact, and descended into the broad, flat plains of northern Italy to begin a campaign that would shake Rome more profoundly than anything it had faced since the Gauls had sacked the city in 390 BCE. Hannibal's genius was the genius of reading terrain and reading his opponent, of understanding not just where an army was but how it thought, what it expected, what it feared, what its habits and reflexes would lead it to do in any given situation. He fought 3 battles against Roman armies in the first 2 years of his Italian campaign, at the Trebia River, at Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cana in 216 BCE. And in each one he used the Roman tendency toward aggressive frontal assault as the instrument of their own destruction, drawing them in and then enveloping them, the Carthaginian wings curling around the Roman flanks like hands closing around something held. Cana was a catastrophe of a scale Rome had never experienced. Roman sources give the number of dead as anywhere from 50 to 70,000 men killed in a single afternoon on a dusty plain in southern Italy. Numbers that are perhaps somewhat inflated, but that speak to a genuine disaster. A day when the Roman army was effectively destroyed as a fighting force, and the question of whether Rome could continue to exist as a political entity must have seemed genuinely uncertain. Hannibal sent the gold rings taken from the fingers of dead Roman knights to Carthage in a bushel measure, to show what had been accomplished. The city of Rome received the news in a silence that the ancient sources describe as the silence of complete shock, of a people trying to absorb something that did not fit within their understanding of what was possible. What Rome did next, in the months and years after Cana, is in many ways the most revealing thing about the Roman character in this period. It did not collapse. It did not negotiate. It grieved, and then it rebuilt, and then it continued more carefully, more patiently, with a new understanding of what Hannibal could do and a new determination to deny him the conditions in which he could do it. The strategy that Rome adopted, associated with the general Quintus Fabius Maximus, who was called the delayer for his preference for attrition over pitched battle, was to avoid engaging Hannibal directly, while slowly grinding down his army through skirmishes and disrupted supply lines, and the systematic reduction of his Italian allies. Hannibal spent 15 years in Italy, moving through the peninsula winning battles, never quite able to deliver the decisive blow that would end the war, gradually finding that his army was shrinking, and his resources were not being replenished, and the Italian communities he had hoped would abandon Rome were, for the most part, remaining loyal or returning to Roman allegiance after brief defections. The loyalty of Rome's Italian allies in this period, not all of them, but most of them, through all the disasters of the early war, was one of the crucial factors in Roman survival, and it speaks to something real about the quality of the Roman alliance system, about the degree to which Rome's subject and allied communities had internalized enough of a stake in the Roman project to stand with it even in its darkest hours. The war turned when the young General Publius Cornelius Scipio took the campaign to Spain and then to Africa, adopting against Carthage the kind of bold strategic thinking that Hannibal had used against Rome. At Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal in the battle that ended the Second Punic War, and the terms of the peace reduced Carthage from a great power to a client state, deprived of its fleet and its overseas empire, and its freedom to make war without Roman permission. Hannibal lived on for years in exile, a brilliant mind without a home, finally taking poison in Bithynia in Asia Minor rather than be handed over to Rome by the local king. There is something quietly melancholy in the image of his ending, the great commander dying in a foreign house, far from the city he had served, and the Italy he had crossed the Alps to conquer, the long adventure of his life concluding in stillness and the smell of the eastern sea. The eastern Mediterranean opened to Rome in the years following the Punic Wars through a series of engagements with the kingdoms that had formed from the fragments of Alexander the Great's empire: the Macedonians, the Seleucids of Syria, the Ptolemies of Egypt. These were ancient and sophisticated political entities, the heirs of Greek culture and Persian administrative tradition, accustomed to a scale of political and cultural achievement that made the Romans feel, initially, somewhat provincial by comparison. The Greek cities of the East had been the cultural centers of the Mediterranean world for centuries. Their philosophers and poets and mathematicians had produced the intellectual inheritance that educated Romans were beginning to take seriously and to absorb into their own developing cultural life. The Roman encounter with Greece was one of the most consequential cultural meetings in Western history, and it happened slowly, not as a single event, but as a gradual, deepening immersion in a civilization of extraordinary richness and complexity. Greek slaves came to Rome as tutors and physicians and artists and craftsmen, and in teaching they also transmitted language, ideas, ways of thinking about the world and humanity and the divine. The Greek gods were mapped onto Roman ones. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Athena became Minerva. The whole Greek divine family absorbed into the Roman religious system, with an ease that speaks to the deep similarities between the two traditions and to Rome's characteristic willingness to incorporate what it found valuable in the cultures it encountered. The poet Horace would write much later that captive Greece captured her fierce conqueror and introduced the arts into rural Latium, a characteristically elegant Roman way of expressing a genuinely complex historical reality. Rome conquered the Greek world militarily. The Greek world conquered Rome culturally. The two conquests happened simultaneously and produced something new from their meeting, something that was neither purely Roman nor purely Greek, but a synthesis of both: the Greco-Roman cultural world that would serve as the foundation of European civilization for 2,000 years. The wealth of the East flowed into Rome in the centuries after the Macedonian and Syrian wars, not just material wealth, though there was plenty of that. The treasuries of Macedonian and Seleucid kings emptied into Roman hands, the art of Greek cities carried back in the holds of Roman ships, the libraries and statues and bronze masterworks that would furnish Roman public spaces and private collections for generations. The wealth also included ideas, philosophical schools and literary forms and architectural principles, and medical knowledge and mathematical insight, all of it flowing into Rome through the channel of conquest and contact, and the endless traffic of educated slaves and freed intellectuals who moved through the Mediterranean world of the 2nd century BCE. The absorption of Greek culture changed what it meant to be an educated Roman. The ideal of the educated man shifted from the purely practical, the farmer-soldier, the skilled orator, the effective magistrate, to something more complex, something that included philosophical reflection and literary appreciation, and the ability to engage with the intellectual traditions of Greece in their original language. Young men from senatorial families began to study Greek as a matter of course, to read Homer and Plato and Thucydides in the original, to spend time in Athens or Rhodes absorbing the atmosphere of cities that had been producing thinkers and artists for centuries. The Roman literary tradition that began to develop seriously in this period, with the comedies of Plautus and Terence, the first Roman historians, the beginning of Roman lyric and epic poetry, was a tradition shaped at every turn by Greek models, adapted to Roman purposes but never quite disentangled from Greek roots. The influx of Eastern wealth also changed the material texture of Roman life in ways that were noticed and debated and worried over by traditionalists who saw in the new luxury a threat to the old virtues. Houses grew larger and more elaborately decorated. Dining became more elaborate and more expensive. Imported fabrics and perfumes and spices and silver plate began to appear in households that would have had none of these things a generation earlier. The simple woolen toga of the old republic, worn over a plain tunic, was still the formal dress of Roman public life. But beneath the surface of public austerity, a richer and more complex private life was developing, a life influenced by the tastes and pleasures of the Greek East. Cato the Elder, the great conservative voice of the 2nd century BCE, looked at all of this with a steady and unfriendly eye. He wrote about farming and about Roman history, and about the Roman way of life with the zeal of a man trying to hold a door closed against a wind he could feel but not quite stop. He warned against Greek influence, against luxury, against the softening of Roman manners that he associated with Eastern contamination. He is remembered partly for his agricultural treatise, the oldest surviving piece of Latin prose, and partly for his repeated insistence in the Senate that Carthage must be destroyed, a formulation he apparently used to conclude his speeches on any subject whatsoever, a kind of rhetorical tic that has made him famous across 2 millennia for its combination of persistence and impracticality. Carthage was eventually destroyed in 146 BCE, a date that also saw the destruction of Corinth by a Roman army, 2 great cities reduced to rubble in the same year. The Mediterranean world reordered around the fact of Roman supremacy. The world that Rome now inhabited was vastly larger than the world of the early republic. The horizons had expanded in every direction, east to the borders of Mesopotamia, south to the North African coast, west to the Atlantic shores of Spain, north to the edges of the Alpine passes. Roman merchants followed Roman armies, and Roman administrators followed Roman merchants, and the whole apparatus of Roman provincial government extended itself across territories that the Romans of the early republic could barely have named, let alone imagined governing. The Mediterranean was becoming, slowly and not without violence and resistance, something that a later Roman would call Mare Nostrum, our sea, a body of water whose shores were, in one way or another, Roman. And yet the expansion brought costs that were not immediately visible, costs that were accumulating quietly in the margins of Roman social and economic life, costs that would eventually become impossible to ignore. The small farmer soldiers of the old republic were spending longer and longer away from their farms on campaigns in Spain or Macedonia or Africa, and when they returned they found that their lands had fallen into disrepair or been absorbed by larger neighbors who had the slaves and the capital to manage them efficiently. The influx of cheap grain from Sicily and Sardinia undercut the prices that Italian farmers could get for their own grain. The great slave-run estates, the latifundia, were spreading across the Italian countryside, worked by the war captives who poured into Italy in the wake of conquest, displacing the free farmers who had been the backbone of the army and the foundation of the republic. This displacement was not a sudden crisis. It was a slow erosion, the kind of change that happens too gradually to be clearly seen by the people living through it, that only becomes visible in retrospect when one generation compares itself to the one before and notices the difference. The small farms were still there. The free farmers were still there, most of them. but their numbers were declining, and the balance of rural Italian life was shifting in ways that would eventually produce the political crises of the late Republic. But that is still ahead, still drifting toward the present on the slow current of time. For now, the sea lies open and still in the early morning, its gray surface softening as the sun climbs above the eastern hills. A Roman merchant ship moves slowly out from the harbor at Puteoli, its single square sail filling gently as the morning breeze picks up off the water. Its hold is full of Italian wine in heavy amphorae, bound for the markets of the eastern Mediterranean, where Roman goods are beginning to appear alongside Greek and Eastern ones in the great trading cities of the Aegean. The sailors speak Latin and Greek, and a little Punic, and a few words of the local languages of wherever they have been most recently, the lingua franca of a sea that is being drawn together. The world is large, the sea is calm, the ship moves outward slowly into the widening morning. There is a particular quality to late afternoon light in autumn. It comes at a low angle, this light, lying almost flat across the surfaces it touches, the worn stone of a public building, the dusty leaves of a plane tree, the slow brown water of a river seen from a bridge. It has a warmth that is different from the warmth of summer light, less assertive, more considered, the warmth of something that knows it will not last, but offers itself generously for the time it has remaining. Shadows are long in this light, stretching far beyond the objects that cast them, as if the world is rehearsing for the dark. Everything looks a little more beautiful than it did at noon, and a little more fragile, and the combination of beauty and fragility gives the afternoon a quality of quiet tenderness that is unlike any other time of day. This is the light in which to think about the late Republic, that long, slow autumn of the system that had sustained Rome through its centuries of growth, that beautiful and fragile season of an old arrangement becoming something it could not remain. The Republic did not fall suddenly. It did not collapse in a single dramatic moment of failure. It softened, gradually, at the edges first and then toward the center. The way a fruit softens in the warmth after it has been picked, the outer surface still holding its color while the interior slowly changes. The process took roughly a century, from the tribunate of Tiberius Gracchus in 133 BCE to the final settlement of Augustus in 27 BCE. And through all that century the institutions of the Republic continued to function. The consuls were elected, the Senate met in its curia, the assemblies voted, the magistrates took their oaths, and yet something fundamental was shifting, something that no law could quite fix and no reform could fully address. The Gracchi brothers are where most accounts of the late Republic's troubles begin, and there is good reason for that. Tiberius Gracchus, tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, attempted to address the problem of land displacement that had been accumulating quietly for generations. The small farmers driven from their holdings, the ager publicus, the public land, occupied illegally by wealthy landowners far beyond the legal limits, the rural poor crowding into Rome and swelling the urban masses, while the land went to those who already had enough. His proposed reform was not radical in its substance. It sought to enforce existing law, to redistribute land that was being illegally held. But in the manner of its pursuit it broke something that had held Roman political life together for a long time. Tiberius, when a colleague tribunally vetoed his land bill, had the colleague removed from office by popular vote, an unprecedented act, a crossing of one of the invisible but real boundaries that separated legitimate political pressure from something else. When he attempted to stand for a second consecutive tribunate, which was also unprecedented. The Senate and its allies moved against him. He died in a mob of senators and their clients on the Capitoline Hill, beaten with the legs of broken chairs, the first Roman magistrate killed in domestic political violence in the memory of the Republic. The fact of his death was not, in itself, the end of something, but it was the first indication that the restraints which had kept Roman political competition within manageable bounds were beginning to lose their hold. His brother Gaius Gracchus, tribune in 123 and 122 BCE, pursued an even broader program of reform with an even greater gift for political organization and popular oratory, and met an end not very different from his brother's. Dying during the suppression of his supporters, his head brought to a political enemy, who is said to have filled the skull with lead to make it heavier, and therefore more valuable as a reward. The deaths of the Gracchi brothers established a pattern, or perhaps revealed a pattern that had always been latent, that the deepest disagreements in Roman political life could no longer be resolved entirely within the formal mechanisms of the republican system. That force was becoming a conceivable option in a way it had not been before. The generation after the Gracchi saw the rise of the great military commanders, whose personal armies and popular followings would gradually make the old republican system unworkable. Gaius Marius, a man from a modest municipal family who had risen through military talent rather than aristocratic connection, served as consul 7 times, a number that would have seemed impossible a century earlier. He reformed the Roman army in ways that transformed its social and political character, accepting volunteers from among the landless poor and equipping them at state expense, creating soldiers whose primary loyalty was to their general rather than to the Roman state, because it was their general who promised them the land grants that were the real reward for military service, and that the state had not committed to providing. The army that Marius created was a more professional, and in many ways more effective fighting force than the old citizen levy. It was also a political instrument in ways the old army had not been, a body of men who would follow their commander in directions that the older citizen soldier would not have followed, because the older citizen soldier had a farm to return to, and a community to answer to, and a sense of himself as a Roman citizen exercising a civic duty, rather than a professional soldier serving an employer. This shift from civic army to professional army, from soldiers who were citizens to soldiers who were professionals, is one of the deepest structural changes of the late Republic, the change that made possible everything that followed. The social war of 91 to 87 BCE, the war in which Rome's Italian allies denied the full Roman citizenship they had long sought and long deserved, rose in revolt against Roman rule, was settled in the end not by military victory alone, but by the extension of citizenship to all free Italians, the act that Tiberius Gracchus and others had been pushing toward for decades finally accomplished under the pressure of armed revolt. The Italy that emerged from the social war was, politically and legally, more unified than it had ever been, a peninsula of Roman citizens rather than a patchwork of Romans and allies. And yet the war itself had accelerated the internal unraveling of the Republic by consuming resources and attention that might have gone to the structural reforms that the system needed. Sulla and Marius, those two great rivals of the late Republic's first generation of warlords, turned the army into a tool of domestic politics in a way that no Roman had done before them. Marius died, old and possibly mad, after his 7th consulship. Sulla marched his legions on Rome itself twice and became dictator, restructuring the republic according to his own somewhat conservative preferences, strengthening the Senate and weakening the tribunes, and then, remarkably, resigning and retiring to private life, dying shortly after of a digestive ailment on his country estate. Sulla's retirement was as remarkable as his coup, a demonstration that a man could seize absolute power and then relinquish it, that the old Roman values were not entirely extinct even in men who had done the most to violate them. But the demonstration was also, in a way, the problem. Sulla's example showed that the institutions of the Republic could be suspended and then apparently restored, that the system was more malleable than anyone had wished to believe. The lesson that ambitious men drew from Sulla was not that power should be laid down, but that power could be seized, that the machinery of the Republic could be operated by a determined man in directions it had not been designed to go. The generation of Caesar was the generation in which this lesson was most fully and most fatally applied. Julius Caesar was a man of extraordinary talents, general, orator, writer, politician, and extraordinary ambition. Ambition of a kind that the republic system was not designed to accommodate because the system was designed specifically to prevent the accumulation of the kind of power that Caesar sought and eventually achieved. His campaigns in Gaul, which he pursued for 9 years and recorded in prose of remarkable clarity and elegance, extended Roman power to the Rhine and the English Channel and the shores of Britain, adding to the Roman world a vast territory of forests and rivers and Celtic peoples that would remain Roman for 5 centuries. The Gallic Wars were also, simultaneously, the building of a personal army of absolute loyalty and the accumulation of a personal reputation that gave Caesar a political weight no senator could easily balance. The crossing of the Rubicon in January of 49 BCE, the small river in northern Italy that marked the boundary of Caesar's lawful military command, which he crossed with his army rather than disband it as the Senate demanded, was the moment at which the Republic's unraveling became irreversible, the moment at which a choice that had been approaching for decades was finally and irrevocably made. The Rubicon was not a great river. It was a modest stream, easily crossed, its banks probably muddy in the January rain. Caesar is said to have paused at its edge and reflected on what crossing meant, and then crossed, quoting a phrase from a Greek playwright, "The die is cast." Whether he actually said this, or whether the story was shaped in the telling to give the moment the weight it deserved, the phrase captures something real about the quality of the decision. The recognition that a certain kind of return was no longer possible, that the path ahead led only forward into an unknown that was also, in a certain sense, inevitable. The civil war between Caesar and the senatorial party led by Pompey was fought across the whole Mediterranean world, in Italy and Spain and Greece and Egypt and North Africa and Asia Minor, as if the world itself were the stage on which this particular drama had to be performed. Pompey died in Egypt, killed on the beach by agents of the Ptolemaic court who hoped to please Caesar, his head presented to the man who had been his father-in-law, and then his rival in a gesture that Caesar reportedly found distressing. Caesar wept, or was said to have wept, for the death of his enemy, a piece of theater perhaps, but perhaps also genuine, the complicated grief of a man who has destroyed what he once loved for the sake of something he loves more. Caesar in Rome after his victory was something the Republic had no clear name for and no clear procedure to manage, more than a magistrate, less than a king, holding power that was indefinite in its extent and in its duration. He was appointed Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator in Perpetuity, a title that broke the fundamental principle of the Republic's magistracies, which were always temporary, always time-limited. He legislated at enormous speed, addressing a backlog of problems that the paralyzed late Republic had been unable to resolve: the calendar, which he reformed with the help of an Alexandrian astronomer into something very close to the calendar we still use; the debt crisis, the repopulation of the Italian countryside, the extension of citizenship. He was also making plans for vast military campaigns to the east, campaigns that would have kept him away from Rome for years. He never left. On the 15th of March, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, a group of senators who called themselves liberators gathered around him in the theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting that day, and stabbed him 23 times. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, which later struck people as meaningful in the way that the arrangements of history sometimes accidentally become meaningful, acquiring a symbolic weight they could not have been intended to carry. He was 55 years old. The assassination of Caesar did not restore the Republic. It could not. The Republic was not something that could be restored by removing the man who had ended it, because the man was not the cause but the symptom, because the conditions that had produced Caesar would inevitably produce someone else, because the army and the money and the popular expectations that had accumulated around the idea of a single commanding figure could not simply be unmade by the removal of the figure who currently embodied them. The assassins had a theory of Roman politics that was no longer connected to the reality of Roman politics, a theory that belonged to a world that had quietly ceased to exist some decades earlier. What followed was another round of civil wars, longer and more exhausting than the first, fought between Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and avenger, and the young man who was Caesar's adopted son and heir, Gaius Octavius, who took the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus after his adoption, and who would eventually be given by the Senate in 27 BCE, the honorific Augustus, the revered one. The wars between Antony and Octavian were wars of attrition as much as of battle, fought in northern Italy and in the east, and culminating at Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's admiral Agrippa defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra on a calm autumn sea in northwestern Greece. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt and died there, he by his own sword, she by her own hand, and the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the last of Caesar's rivals ended together in an Alexandrian palace by the sea. Octavian, Augustus, was now the undisputed master of the Roman world. He was 32 years old, and he had lived through more violence and uncertainty than most men encounter in a full lifetime. And he was careful and patient and highly intelligent. And he understood something that Caesar had not quite understood, that the Romans would accept a monarch if the monarch did not call himself a monarch. The settlement he constructed in the years between 27 and 23 BCE was a work of extraordinary political subtlety, a system in which all the forms of the Republic were preserved. The Senate still met, the consuls were still elected, the assemblies still gathered, while the substance of power resided entirely in the hands of one man who held a carefully selected collection of republican offices and honors that together amounted to something Rome had no word for because it had never existed before. He called himself princeps, first citizen, and called the system the principate, and the Latin word for first citizen is the origin of our word prince, which perhaps tells us something about how the thing that was created gradually revealed its nature to later ages. He controlled the armies through his command of the frontier provinces where the legions were stationed. He controlled finance through his personal wealth, which was vast beyond any previous private fortune, and through his administrative control of the imperial treasury. He controlled policy through his auctoritas, his authority, his prestige, the accumulated weight of his achievements, and his position that made his preferences impossible to ignore even when they were expressed as suggestions rather than commands. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, that Augustus established, and that his successors maintained through the first 2 centuries of the imperial era was, in its way, one of the most remarkable achievements in human history, not because it was perfect or just, or without the ordinary human suffering that accompanies any political arrangement, but because of its sheer geographical and temporal extent. Across an area stretching from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and the Danube to the Sahara, a population of perhaps 50 to 60 million people lived under a single administrative system, connected by a network of roads and protected by a professional army stationed at the edges of the empire, able to move through a world where the same coin was accepted in a market in York, and a market in Alexandria, and a market in Antioch. Augustus ruled for 44 years and died in his bed in 14 CE at the age of 75, an almost unimaginable longevity for a man who had spent his youth in civil war. He died at Nola in southern Italy, the town where his father had also died, and his last words, according to the biographer Suetonius, were a question to those around him, whether he had played his part in the comedy of life well enough. The theatrical metaphor is perfect and deliberate, the dying statesman aware to the last of the performance he had been giving, the careful artifice of a system that was a monarchy dressed in republican clothing, worn so long and so consistently that the clothing had become, for most people, indistinguishable from the man himself. The emperors who followed Augustus were a varied group, varied in temperament and in ability and in the quality of their reigns, and the 2 centuries of the Pax Romana were not a single smooth and uniform experience, but a series of distinct periods with distinct characters. Tiberius, the dour and capable stepson of Augustus who succeeded him, was an effective administrator who became increasingly paranoid and reclusive in his later years, retreating to the island of Capri and governing the empire from a distance through letters and intermediaries. Caligula, who followed Tiberius, provided the Roman senatorial class with the experience of a ruler whose behavior was erratic and insulting, and sometimes genuinely terrifying, and who was assassinated by members of his own guard after less than 4 years of rule, the Praetorian prefects discovering that the power they had been given to protect the emperor was also the power to choose a different one. Claudius, who was pulled from behind a curtain in the palace during the confusion following Caligula's assassination and declared emperor by the Praetorian Guard, proved to be a more capable ruler than his undignified beginning suggested. A scholarly man who had spent his early life in the margins of public life, who knew Roman history with unusual depth, and who governed with a quiet thoroughness that belied his awkward public manner. His reign saw the beginning of the Roman conquest of Britain, an island that Caesar had visited and Rome had long eyed, finally brought within the empire in 43 CE. The legions crossed the Channel on a gray morning and marched into a country of forests and rivers and tribal kingdoms, and Britain became Roman, or as Roman as anything so far from Rome and so particular in its character could become. Nero, who followed Claudius, began his reign with a period of moderate and reasonable government guided by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, and then slowly, as his guides retired or died, revealed the more difficult aspects of his character: the artistic vanity, the violent insecurity, the killing of his own mother and his first wife, the performance of his own poetry and music in public competitions in which no one dared to judge against him. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which burned for 9 days and destroyed large parts of the city, was attributed by rumor to Nero himself, though the historical evidence for his direct involvement is thin. He blamed the Christians, a small and poorly understood community in Rome at the time, and the persecution that followed was the first direct Roman governmental action against them. Local, limited, more about political convenience than religious policy, but remembered afterward as the beginning of something. After Nero came the year of the four emperors, 69 CE, a year of civil wars in which four men held the title in rapid succession, a demonstration that the Augustan system's greatest structural weakness, the absence of a clear mechanism for selecting successors, could produce precisely the kind of chaos that the whole elaborate arrangement had been designed to prevent. Vespasian, the fourth of that year's emperors, was a solid and practical man from a municipal Italian family, a professional soldier of wide experience, and he brought to the Principate a quality it had sometimes lacked: a certain earthy realism about what the job required and what was sufficient to do it well. His dynasty, the Flavians, lasted until 96 CE and included his son Domitian, a capable but deeply suspicious ruler whose reign ended in assassination, and whose memory was condemned by the Senate in the formal act of damnatio memoriae, the erasure of a name from public records and monuments, though names are more resilient than stone, and the erasure was never complete. The five emperors who followed, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, are often called the five good emperors, a designation that reflects the relative stability and competence of their reigns rather than any saintly perfection of personal character. Trajan expanded the empire to its greatest geographical extent, conquering Dacia across the Danube and campaigning deep into Mesopotamia. His victories commemorated on the great spiral column that still stands in Rome, its carved reliefs winding upward through 100 scenes of campaign and conquest, soldiers building bridges and crossing rivers and fighting battles and accepting surrenders. The whole story of an army at work depicted in stone, with a quiet specificity that makes it feel like something lived rather than something imagined. Hadrian traveled his empire the way a gardener walks a large garden, attentively, methodically, noticing what needed attention and providing it. He built the wall across northern Britain that bears his name, that long stone line across the windswept moors that still runs for miles through the landscape, defining a boundary, marking an edge, saying quietly in stone that here the empire ends and the north begins, that here the known world gives way to something else. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome, that extraordinary circular temple whose concrete dome spans 43 meters without a single supporting column and whose oculus, the circular opening at the dome's summit, lets in a column of sunlight that moves slowly across the interior walls through the hours of the day, a slow clock of divine light measuring time in a building that is itself a model of the universe, the dome representing the vault of heaven, the floor representing the earth, the oculus the sun. The Pantheon is still standing. Its concrete dome is still intact. The column of sunlight still moves through the interior on clear days, touching the walls with its slow warmth, doing what it has always done, as if time in that building is measured in a different unit than time outside it. Not years or decades, but the longer, quieter measure of stone and light, and the patient endurance of beautiful things. Marcus Aurelius, the last of the five, was a philosopher-emperor in a more than ceremonial sense, a man who had absorbed the Stoic tradition so deeply and so genuinely that it shaped not only his public rhetoric but his private practice, the way he actually thought and felt and struggled with the difficulties of his position. His private journal, the Meditations, written in Greek during the long campaigns on the Danube frontier, is one of the most intimate documents to survive from the ancient world, a man talking to himself, reminding himself of what he believed, asking himself whether he was living according to his principles, noting with patient self-awareness the ways in which he fell short. There is something quietly moving about reading it, the most powerful man in the world reminding himself, in a private notebook, to be patient with people who frustrate him, to remember that everything passes, to do what is right without requiring recognition for doing it. His reign was marked by external pressure of a kind that the empire had not faced in the same way before. The Great Plague that swept the Mediterranean world in the 160s and 170s CE, killing millions across the empire's vast territory, disrupting trade and agriculture, and the administrative machinery of government. The increasing pressure on the Danubian frontier from the Germanic peoples to the north, who were themselves being pushed southward by movements of other peoples from further east, the beginning of the great migrations that would eventually reshape the map of the Western world. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his reign on campaign on the Danube, fighting to hold a frontier that required constant attention, dying on campaign in 180 CE, the last of the dynasty that had given the empire its longest period of relative peace and good government. The evening is long in autumn. The light holds on the western faces of the hills, the gold deepening to amber, the shadows growing longer and softer, the city settling into the quiet of the approaching dark. The forum below is emptying of its afternoon crowds, the last conversations drifting on the cooling air, the merchants packing their stalls, the magistrates concluding their business, the pigeons settling on the roof lines of the old temples. The empire is vast, and for the moment it holds together, the roads running outward in all directions from this center, carrying goods and messages and soldiers and ideas to the edges of a world so large that it takes months to cross it in any direction. The legions are on the frontiers, watching the rivers and the forests beyond. The cities of the east are going about their business in the warm evening, the markets of Alexandria and Antioch and Ephesus still busy as the sun declines toward the western sea. There is a quality to this moment, the late afternoon of the Pax Romana, the long golden autumn of the empire at its fullest extent, that has a particular beauty, as all autumn afternoons have a particular beauty, the beauty of things at their most complete before the cooling begins. The shadows are long. The light is warm. The city breathes in the evening quiet. But the seasons change as they have always changed, and winter, quiet and patient, is always on its way.